21-year-old Henry John Burnett sat alone in a cell at Craiginch's prison in Aberdeen and contemplated the fact he was facing a death sentence. He had been sure that the best course of action was not to appeal the verdict, but to rely on a petition against the verdict that had been started and signed by many who felt the death sentence handed down to Henry had been so very wrong, and that the petition would see he got a reprieve. He had been so sure of that, but as the date of his hanging got closer, he was beginning to wonder if he had judged this very wrong. Thomas, or Tommy Guyan, and Margaret Henderson's relationship began like any other. They met and fell in love, eventually marrying on the 2nd of February 1957, when Tommy was 21 and Margaret was 19. Margaret had lived with and been brought up, along with her sister, by her grandmother, Annie Henderson. And so the newly married Tommy and Margaret moved into Margaret's grandmother's first-floor spacious flat at 14 Jackson Terrace in Aberdeen, a 9-minute walk north of Aberdeen city centre, as husband and wife. Tommy worked as a merchant seaman and was away from home a lot, so it likely suited the young couple to stay with Margaret's grandmother, so Margaret wouldn't be alone when Tommy was at sea for long periods of time. Married life appeared to suit the couple, and they had a happy marriage, welcoming their first child in September 1958. However, cracks began to appear in the marriage eventually, due to Tommy being at sea so often and Margaret being left without her husband to raise their child. And so when Margaret announced she was expecting a second child, but that Tommy wasn't the father, the marriage was further strained, and the pair began to argue regularly. Margaret's second child was born in February 1961, and by this time Margaret, unable to carry on with her marriage as it was, had sought legal advice about divorcing Tommy. However, back in the early 1960s in Scotland, it was not easy for a woman to divorce a man. Tommy hadn't been unfaithful, he was not abusive, he had not deserted her, Margaret had merely fallen out of love with Tommy. And so sadly, there was no grounds for Margaret to seek a divorce from Tommy, and Tommy refused to agree to a divorce. And so Margaret felt she had no choice but to struggle on in a loveless marriage. In a bid to try and cope with the despair Margaret felt of being trapped in a loveless marriage to Tommy, in December 1962, she got herself a job working as a fish filleter for a fish curers in Aberdeen. It was here that Margaret and her 19-year-old colleague Henry, or Harry Burnett, first met, and the pair were instantly attracted to one another. With Tommy being away at sea so often, and for such long periods of time, it left Margaret and Henry to see each other very regularly, almost acting like they were husband and wife. And so, after a few months of Henry and Margaret seeing each other, the inevitable happened. Margaret left the flat she shared with Tommy and her grandmother, taking her youngest son Keith with her, and moved into accommodation with Henry at Skene Terrace, which was a 20-minute walk southwest of where she had lived with her husband and grandmother. I assume she didn't take her eldest son with her, but instead left him with her grandmother and husband, as it was likely Tommy would not have accepted she take their child with her. But as he was not the father of Margaret's youngest son Keith, there was little he could do about her taking him. However, all was not quite as Margaret had expected when she left her husband to move in with Henry Burnett. Henry was a very jealous person and was quite unstable in his moods. It didn't take long for Margaret to realise just what a mistake she had made by moving in with Henry, as he had convinced himself that she was going to leave him, just like she had Tommy. And so he took to locking her up in the house when he went out, and she was seldom allowed out on her own. In the short time she had been living with Henry, Margaret had come to realise that she had to leave. She did not want to live her life this way, despite the strong feelings she still had for Henry. On the 31st of May 1963, on one of the rare days Henry had allowed Margaret to go out on her own, an opportunity presented itself to Margaret, and she saw a way she could escape Henry, with the pair having lived together for just over a couple of months at this point. Margaret had bumped into her husband Tommy on this particular day, who had only recently returned from sea and was still heartbroken about Margaret leaving him, and so he asked her if she would return to him. Margaret instantly agreed and told him she would move back in with him that very day. And so Margaret set off with a spring in her step back to Skene Terrace to collect her son and her belongings. Now there's a couple of different versions about what happened next. One is that Margaret was accompanied to Skene Terrace by family friend Georgina Catanna, who was 66 years old, but other reports say she had gone back alone. So Margaret, with or without Georgina, returned back to Skene Terrace at 4 p.m. It appeared that Georgina had stayed outside the property if she had been there, but that either she or the landlord of the property started banging on the door when they'd heard the commotion coming from inside. Upon Margaret telling Henry that she was leaving him, he had been furious and had screamed, "Margaret, Margaret, you're not going to leave me." He then got a knife and put it against Margaret's throat. All the while, either Georgina or the landlord of the property, having heard the commotion, were banging on the door to get Henry to let them in and stop what he was doing to Margaret. Shortly after, Henry had threatened Margaret with a knife. He threw the door open and ran away. Margaret was found in the flat, very shaken, with blood coming from a slight cut to her neck from where Henry had held the knife. But she was helped to collect her son and a few of her belongings before heading to the flat at 14 Jackson Terrace, where her husband, grandmother and eldest son were waiting for her. While Margaret was making her way to the flat at 14 Jackson Terrace, shaken but all right, Henry had first gone to his older brother Frank's work in a rage, where he had told him that Margaret had said she was leaving him and that he'd held a knife to her throat. Frank apparently told Henry that he should go to the police, and upon Henry leaving Frank's work, Frank was under the impression that Henry was now a lot calmer and that he was intending to go to the police. Little did he know that Henry was still filled with rage and vengeance, and instead of going to the police station, he asked a friend to drive him to his brother Frank's home in Bridge of Dawn, which is a 15-minute drive north of Aberdeen, as he knew his brother had a shotgun at his house. However, Frank's wife Susie was at home, and Frank had told her never to open a cabinet where his shotgun was if he wasn't at home, and so she refused to give it to Henry. Now somehow Susie became distracted, and it was at this point Henry forced the lock on the cabinet, removed the shotgun and cartridges, and left his brother's home at Bridge of Dawn, intent on heading directly to 14 Jackson Terrace. Margaret was still a bit unsettled by the violent reaction of her lover Henry upon her telling him she was leaving, but she was beginning to feel a bit calmer now she was back at Jackson Terrace. As she sat on the couch in the living room in the early evening of the 31st of May, 1963, she looked around her. The TV was on with a children's programme playing, with her husband Tommy sat on a chair beside the fire. Her grandmother Annie sat with Keith on her knee, both watching the TV, and family friend Georgina was in the kitchen making them all a nice cup of tea. It wasn't perfect, Margaret thought. She did still love Henry, and she had no idea how she and Tommy were going to work things out, if they even could, but she did not think about that just now. Suddenly, there was a commotion outside the living room, and Georgina was heard to shout, "You can't come in here!" Margaret saw Tommy get up and walk quickly towards the living room door. She heard him ask the intruder, "Who are you?" And then there was an almighty bang. Everything happened so quickly then. Margaret saw her husband Tommy fall to the floor with his face covered in blood, and Henry appeared in the living room, brandishing a shotgun. He grabbed Margaret and dragged her out of the flat, down the close stairs, where he aimed his hastily reloaded shotgun at a 13-year-old boy who was coming up the close stairs as Henry and Margaret were running down. But the boy got out of the way, and Margaret was again dragged down the rest of the stairs by Henry. Outside, he dragged her along the streets until they came out at a petrol station, and he dragged her to a car that was being filled with petrol, where Henry said to the man filling the car, "Is this your car, pal? I'll take it now." The man was shocked by the sudden appearance of Henry and Margaret, and wasn't happy about his car being taken, and so he tried to let the back tires of the car down, only to be threatened by Henry holding the shotgun, and so he stepped away, and could only watch in shock as his car, driven by Henry with Margaret in the passenger seat, was driven out of the petrol station. The man whose car had just been taken was John Irvin, and he immediately rang the police to tell them what had taken place. Back at Jackson Terrace, Georgina and Margaret's grandmother Annie tried to comfort Margaret's young son Keith, while being in disbelief and shock at what had taken place, and were worried sick about what Henry would do to Margaret, having just shot Tommy Guyan in the face, which had left Tommy lying dead on the floor, with the left side of his face shattered. He was 27 years old. The 13-year-old boy who had been confronted by Henry in the stairwell had also called the police. So when they received the call from John Irvin saying that a man with a shotgun had stolen his car, following John giving them a description of his car, the police immediately sprang into action, and the description was circulated to all officers, and the car was quickly spotted heading north, leaving Aberdeen, and so the police gave chase. However, about 15 miles or 24 kilometres north of Aberdeen, Henry Burnett pulled the car over to the side of the road, but not before he had asked Margaret to marry him, and she had replied that she would. When Henry was approached by police officers, the rage that had consumed him not long before appeared to have left him, as he offered no resistance to being arrested, merely telling the police officers that, "It's me you want." He was then led away. Henry would soon seal his fate, as when he was to be interviewed by detectives, his first words to them were, "I gave him both barrels. He must be dead." Henry, or Harry John Burnett, was charged with assaulting Margaret by cutting her throat with a knife, with also assaulting John Innes and stealing his car, and for the murder of Tommy Guyan by shooting him with a shotgun. And his trial began in July 1963 with a packed courtroom and long queues of people waiting outside the courthouse in the hopes of taking someone's place at the trial if they left. Henry's defence had lodged a plea of insanity at the time of the offence, in the hope of avoiding a death sentence. But according to an article by John Forsyth in 2012, the outcome of Henry receiving a death sentence felt inevitable, as the law had been reformed in 1957, which had limited capital punishment to a few methods of murder, and the use of a firearm to commit murder was on the list. And there was no doubt that Henry had stolen his brother's shotgun and had shot Tommy Guyan in the face at close range. However, the reform had been established to try and deter armed robbery, and so the defence were determined to try and prove that not only had Henry not been of sound mind at the time of shooting Tommy and was not in control of his actions, but also that his use of a firearm had been as a crime of passion, and therefore didn't warrant a sentence of death, as the use of a firearm in this case was not meant to be one of robbery. Henry's mum, Matilda, was called to the stand to try and back up the defence's theory. However, Matilda became extremely upset and began to cry uncontrollably when asked about Henry's school and background. Seeing his mum like this, Henry became angry and had to be grabbed by the two police officers sitting beside him, Henry demanding that his mother be let off the stand. He hated seeing her so upset. However, Henry's mum wanted to do what she could for her son, so she shouted to him, "Henry, it's okay, my loon. I'm okay." Loon meaning boy in Aberdeen. According to the Blood and Granite book by Norman Adams, the judge presiding over the trial felt the need to make sure that Matilda didn't break down on the stand again by saying, "You understand you have been brought here as a witness by your son's legal advisors, presumably to help your son's interests. If you look at it from that point of view, perhaps you can be more composed." Matilda then went on to tell of Henry's troubled background, saying in a shaky voice that he had played truant from school regularly, that he had previously threatened both herself and his sister with a knife, and that he had attempted to take his own life in 1961 when he was a teenager, following the breakdown of a relationship. The court was also told, according to an article written by John Forsyth in 2012, that Henry had also attended hospital following trying to take his own life, but that he had left after being advised that he should admit himself into hospital as a voluntary patient, and apparently he had never acted on this advice. Matilda also admitted that he had been known to fly into an awful rage, and that at these times she had been frightened of him. As she left the witness box, Matilda looked over at Henry and smiled at him, and Henry smiled back, presumably to reassure her, but likely also pleased that his mum was now getting to leave the witness box. Henry's dad also took to the witness box and told the court how Henry used to take awful turns, going on to say that Henry could be very unpredictable, would just go mad, appear to lose focus, eyes just staring, and that he didn't feel Henry was responsible for his actions at these times. According to the Blood and Granite book, Henry's dad also said that Henry had been okay until he was 12 years old, following him having an accident. However, on cross-examination, it was quickly established that it had been Henry's legs that had been injured in his accident, not his head. As the defence was trying to establish that Henry had not been responsible for his actions at the time of shooting Tommy Guyan and that he had diminished responsibility, also called to the stand was Dr. Ian Lowett, who was a consultant psychiatrist at Aberdeen Sick Children's Hospital, and had not only been the doctor who had assessed Henry when he had gone into hospital following trying to take his own life and had advised that he admit himself voluntarily to hospital, but Dr. Lowett had also been asked to assess Henry's mental state at Craiginsh's prison 3 days after he had shot Tommy Guyan. Dr. Lowett was asked what his assessment had been of Henry when he had first met him following trying to take his own life, to which Dr. Lowett said that his diagnosis at the time had been that Henry was a psychopath who was depressed and needed treatment. But as Henry had entered the hospital voluntarily, he could not stop him from leaving before receiving treatment. He went on to say that it was likely Henry had suffered an injury to his brain at an early age. However, under cross-examination, he did say that he had no evidence of this, and it had already been determined that the accident his dad had referred to had injured Henry's legs, not his head, and it doesn't appear any other injury sustained to Henry's head had been mentioned by his family. Dr. Lowett advised that, in his professional opinion, Henry was suffering from psychopathy, explaining that it was a mental disorder which was recognised under the Mental Health Act, and that he believed Henry had been of unsound mind when he had attacked Margaret and shot her husband Tommy. He was then asked by the prosecution if he also believed Henry was of unsound mind when he had threatened John Irvin before stealing his car, to which Dr. Lowett said he was not prepared to comment on that. He did say that Henry's whole life comprised of impulsive, unconsidered acts, such as threatening his mum and sister with a knife and trying to take his own life, and attending hospital and then discharging himself against medical advice. Dr. Lowett also added that Henry also apparently had a fear of throttling people and that he had sought medical advice because of this, going on to say that, "I believe him to be insane insofar as he was incapable of considering the consequences of these acts." Although in the article by John Forsyth, Dr. Lowett also admitted that despite Henry's actions being impulsive, he believed he was aware of what he was doing, giving the example that Henry had travelled to and from his brother Frank's home in order to secure a weapon, the shotgun. While Dr. Lowett did his best to assert that, in his medical opinion, Henry Burnett was not responsible for the actions he had carried out, despite being aware of what he was doing, Dr. Lowett had never given expert evidence in court before, had no idea what to expect, and apparently had not been prepared by the defence, and so he was not prepared when the prosecution ripped his testimony apart, ridiculed his evidence, and undermined everything he said, so much so that by the time Dr. Lowett left the stand, he believed his testimony had done more damage to Henry's case than good, despite the fact that neurologist Dr. John Gaylor also took to the stand and said that following tests been carried out on Henry's brain, he believed strongly that Henry was insane at the time of the shooting, and that Henry required institutional care and should not be hanged. Dr. Lowett concluded that Henry Burnett displayed psychopathic tendencies and had likely not been responsible for his actions the day he murdered Tommy. The evidence given by both Dr. Lowett and Dr. Gaylor, having been mocked and ridiculed in the court, had apparently also been mocked and ridiculed in the newspapers afterwards. Margaret also took to the stand at Henry's trial and repeated what had happened in the flat where Tommy had been shot. She said that they had heard a commotion and Tommy had stood up, and upon seeing Henry, he had asked him who he was, but that Henry had not answered. Instead, he shot Tommy, and that Tommy had fallen to the floor. Henry had then grabbed Margaret and dragged her from the flat all the way to the petrol station, where Henry had stolen a car. She concluded by saying that just before Henry had pulled the car over and surrendered to the police, he had asked her if she would marry him, and she had readily agreed that she would. And then, before the trial had even properly begun, having lasted only 3 days, and with Henry himself not taking to the stand, the defence and prosecution were summing up, with Margaret's background of being unfaithful to her husband while he was at sea being brought up and remarked to have been sordid. with the judge adding, according to the Blood and Granite book, that while Margaret may have been described as a femme fatale, or a somewhat fickle and immortal woman, it was not up to the jurors to pass judgment. They were only to consider if she was a credible witness. And while he recognised that the 10 women and 5 men of the jury had a difficult decision to make of whether Henry Burnett had been responsible for his actions or not, he advised them that they must not shrink from their duties. Before finally the jury left to deliberate. However, they didn't deliberate for very long, taking only 25 minutes to reach a majority verdict of 13-2. And so with Tommy and Henry's family both being present for the verdict, the judge pronounced that Henry John Burnett had been found guilty on all 3 charges of assaulting Margaret and John Irvin and of murdering Tommy Guyan, and that he would suffer death by hanging. Before the judge then brushed the black cap against his forehead, which according to the Blood and Granite book was a 3-cornered hat. This was done when a judge was giving out the death penalty. Henry's family were devastated by this outcome, with Henry's sister Mary standing up and crying out, according to the Press and Journal on the 26th of July 1963, "Oh no, they canna do that to him. It's her should be in here, no him." Mary's brother Francis put his arm around his distraught sister, and she was then led from the courtroom by her brother and father. Judge Lord Wheatley then gave the execution date of Thursday the 15th of August 1963, before the pale-faced but composed Henry Burnett was taken to the cells, as Tommy's sister Margaret watched on from the public benches and wept. In the week following the verdict of death by hanging being pronounced, Margaret Guyan, who had been Tommy Guyan's wife and Henry Burnett's lover, had to go into hiding following threats to her life. But not before she said, according to the BBC News in August 2013, "I am sorry Tommy had to die, but I never knew it would end this way. On the day of the murder, my husband and I were together again, but I knew it would be the same old story, and we would part. My heart is with Harry. I can't say why, but I know I still love him. I said I would marry him before, and I still stand by him." And apparently Henry still loved Margaret too, as he had said in a letter he had sent his brother Frank before the trial that he didn't want his family to blame Margaret for what he had done, that she had no idea that he was going to do that, saying that he didn't actually know he was going to do it himself. But he went on to say in the letter that the fact that Margaret still loved him meant more to him than anything else. Although by the time Henry had received his sentence of death and was being held in the recently built condemned block of Craiginches prison, his feelings towards Margaret appeared to have changed, as according to the Blood and Granite book, he told his brother Frank and sister Mary when they visited him that he had finished with Margaret and that he didn't want to see her again. In the days following the death sentence being given to Henry, his defence solicitors, who apparently were shocked by the guilty verdict, immediately lodged a petition for clemency with the Scottish Secretary Michael Noble to consider, with one of Henry's solicitors saying that the petition would be on the grounds of Henry's mental condition. Henry had instructed his defence solicitors that he did not want them to make an appeal. He felt that a petition would be the better route to take, especially as not only were Henry's family campaigning for a reprieve, but this was also being backed by Tommy's family too, with Tommy's mother saying in an article for the Press and Journal newspaper in July 1963 that, "I can find it in my heart to forgive Henry Burnett. It's his mother I'm sorry for. I know what she must be going through. I'll sign the petition. I don't think Henry Burnett should hang." With Tommy's brother John also adding in the same article that, "I don't think Burnett should hang. There's obviously something wrong with him." So while Henry's defence solicitors and Henry and Tommy's family did all they could to secure a reprieve for Henry, Henry began to feel confident that he would not be facing his death on Thursday the 15th of August, mere weeks away. However, the toll on Margaret of her husband being murdered and her lover being found guilty of his murder and been sentenced to hang, as well as the death threat she was receiving, culminated in Margaret becoming seriously ill and being rushed to hospital by ambulance a week before the execution date, where it was reported by the Press and Journal newspaper on Friday the 9th of August 1963 that she was receiving treatment and was said by a doctor to be satisfactory. Margaret had continued to reside with her grandmother and children at 14 Jackson Terrace when she wasn't in hiding, where Henry had shot and murdered her husband. so both of these things were bound up in causing Margaret some distress. Henry, too, was becoming distressed, as despite Henry and Tommy's family petitioning and receiving well over the target of 2,000 signatures calling for Henry to be given a reprieve, despite the Scottish Secretary Michael Noble being asked to give Henry a reprieve and receiving all of the trial papers to look over, and despite a last-minute plea on the eve of the hanging, according to the Blood and Granite book, by Aberdeen's Lord Provost, which according to Wikipedia is the governor of the local authority, the civic head and the Lord Lieutenant, no reprieve was forthcoming, and was officially denied on the 14th of August, the day before the execution date. Henry spent his last day saying his goodbyes to his family, telling them, according to an article in the Daily Record newspaper, "Don't worry about me." Despite Henry having told his family that his relationship with Margaret Guyan was over, apparently the pair met for one final goodbye in his prison cell the day before his hanging. After Henry had said his final goodbyes and was alone in his cell, he was given a drink of whiskey and had apparently slept quite well that night. He refused another drink of whiskey on the morning of his execution, Thursday the 15th of August, but had a cup of tea instead, before being taken to a room leading on to the execution chamber. Here, a short religious service was carried out with a prison chaplain and a local reverend, who had visited Henry every day in the weeks leading up to his execution, saying later that Henry had been sincerely sorry for what he had done and that he'd been quite a decent lad at heart. Also on the morning of the execution, a crowd of around 200 men, women and children gathered quietly outside Craiginch's prison, with a sole demonstrator wearing a placard which said, "Abolish legal murder," and "Vengeance is mine beneath the Lord," who walked back and forward along the pavement, under the watchful eye of 5 police officers. At 8:01 a.m. on Thursday the 15th of August 1963, 21-year-old Henry John Burnett was hanged following being convicted of murdering 27-year-old Tommy Guyan, with Henry's death certificate stating that the cause of death had been judicial hanging. According to a Press and Journal newspaper article in July 1963, Henry Burnett was the first man to hang at Craiginch's prison since it had been built more than 70 years prior, and Henry Burnett was also the last man to be hanged in Scotland. It was customary following a person being hanged for prison wardens to post a notice on the gates which said that the condemned man was now dead. However, by 8:15 a.m. this had not taken place, and so when a number of prison wardens came out of the prison, a few in the crowd began to boo and shouted, "You murderers!" At which point one of the guards told the crowd that it was all over and that there would be no notice displayed and that the crowd should go home. However, this only served to anger the crowd, with several of them shouting that a notice needed to be displayed, as how else would they know that Henry had died? The notice was never forthcoming, and it took a further 2 hours before the crowd eventually started to disperse. I don't know why everyone there that day was so determined that a notice should be displayed, possibly because it had always been common practice, and if so, then I don't know why the decision had been made not to display the notice as before, which only served to antagonise the crowd gathered. Following Henry being executed, his body was placed in a coffin and buried on the grounds of Craiginch's prison in an unmarked grave behind the execution block, which had only been built the previous year, despite an execution not having taken place in Aberdeen for 106 years. So we've heard that 2 experts at Henry's trial believed that he had been insane at the time of Tommy's murder, and that he should not be hanged but receive specialist care. We heard how not only Henry's family but Tommy's family too were behind a petition to get a reprieve for Henry. We've heard how an execution had not taken place in Aberdeen for 106 years before Henry's, and actually the Murder, Abolition of Death Penalty Act 1965 suspended the death penalty for murder for a period of 5 years, with the abolition being permanent in 1969. But what do you think? Should 21-year-old Henry Burnett have been hanged? And if it was believed that he shouldn't be hanged, then why was a reprieve not given by Scottish Secretary Michael Noble, despite expert opinions, and a petition with both families behind it, which had reached over 2,000 signatures? Well, it could very well be that Henry Burnett himself was behind his reprieve not being forthcoming. While Henry was being held in the execution block awaiting his hanging, he was being monitored around the clock by the prison guards, but little did he know that the guards were also recording everything he said, or anything they heard when Henry's family were visiting him, as well as taking copies of all correspondence that left the prison by Henry, all of which were sent to the Scottish Secretary to aid him in deciding whether to give Henry a reprieve or not. But nobody knew about this, or what had been recorded by the prison guards. That was until an article was written by John Forsyth in 2012, which makes for very interesting reading. John Forsyth had not only set eyes on what was recorded by the prison guards, who were monitoring Henry, but also the correspondence that Henry had sent to his family. John Forsyth also tracked down a number of those who had been involved in Henry's trial, including psychiatrist Dr. Lowett, and this is what he found out. On the 7th of August 1963, 8 days before Henry was executed, 3 psychiatrists visited Henry to establish if he was sane enough to hang, with the outcome of this visit to help the Scottish Secretary decide whether he should grant Henry a reprieve and instead sentence him to life imprisonment. The psychiatrists confirmed that Henry was of a psychopathic personality, and that this psychopathic personality was to such a degree that it mitigated his responsibility for the crime he committed. So the psychiatrists were clearly trying to help get Henry a reprieve, saying in their opinion Henry was not responsible for his actions. So why hadn't the Scottish Secretary given Henry a reprieve? Well, it would appear that Henry was so sure he would receive a reprieve that he appeared to think that what he said while not in the presence of psychiatrists wouldn't matter. But how wrong he was. Remember I said that the prison guards were ordered to record everything Henry said or anything they heard? Well, it was reported by the guards that following the 3 psychiatrists leaving Craiginch's prison, Henry had said, "I knew exactly what I was doing. I thought no more of shooting Guyan than I would of shooting a bird." Clearly, he had fooled the psychiatrists. But we only had the word of the prison guards that Henry actually said this. Was there anything else that had led the Scottish Secretary to believe Henry did not warrant a reprieve? Yes, there was. Following a visit from his ex-lover Margaret, he wrote to her, and a copy of this letter also made its way to the Scottish Secretary, and it read, "What they were saying in court was a heap of rubbish about me being insane, even at the time." He then went on to apparently answer Margaret's question of why he hadn't killed her too, and he wrote, "Well, my darling, it was because I loved you. I could easily have done it if I wanted to." Henry, perhaps having thought it not a good idea to put in writing that he wasn't insane when he desperately needed everyone to believe he was, and so he asked Margaret to destroy the letter, not realising that it was too late. A copy had already been made by the prison officers. One of the last recordings the prison officers had made was to state that Henry believed that he would receive a reprieve. Despite these findings and the passage of time, in the article, Dr. Ian Lowett still felt that he had badly let down Henry Burnett due to his lack of experience at giving evidence in a court setting. He said that the experience had been devastating, that he was completely torn to bits by the prosecution, and that he was not prepared for the onslaught he was subjected to, feeling they were trying to ridicule and minimise my evidence. And finally, according to Wikipedia, Craiginch's prison closed permanently in January 2014, and the grounds were earmarked for development. In early August 2014, the remains of Henry Burnett were exhumed from the prison and taken to Aberdeen Crematorium, where a private ceremony was held on the 7th of August 2014. So that's it. Come back next time for another episode of Scottish Murders.
Scottish Murders is a production of Clurin Ton.